Good, I think we're ready to rock and roll. It's our pleasure to have Dr. Gretchen Mayfield with us this afternoon. She's with Oklahoma State University in the meat science program there. She's going to be talking about looking at the carcass, finding new and quality affordable cuts of meat. And there's a good evidence that we've been successful in some of that area. It's always a great pleasure. But think about that end product that we produce and how it gets used, it gets used by the consumer and finding new uses. So, Gretchen.
Thank you. So first, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it, the opportunity to come and speak, talk about a few value-added cuts that we have, a few different cutting technologies that we're trying to implement in the meat industry, some things that we've worked on at Oklahoma State, also that NCBA has worked on to try to come up with ways to better utilize these carcasses that we may call too heavy or too big, and why that's an issue and why that it isn't an issue and we can really benefit from producing more pounds. So we'll go through that. This is not my normal time slot to talk at right after lunch. I'll do my best to keep you awake. I usually have right before lunch at school. That's one of my main teaching slots, so everybody stays awake because they're antsy to get going. We've heard a lot this morning about breeds that people maybe don't like Charolais, or breeds that they do like. I only have one breed that I have major dislike for, because when I was in, and it's not Charolais, when I was in grad school, I'll never forget this, had to leave home on Christmas Day from my hometown in Alney, Texas, and I had to drive to Emporia, Kansas to grade 800 head of beef carcasses of this one breed type. And I could have done it probably from my living room because I never graded so many select and standard yield grade 4s in my entire life. So it was not an enjoyable experience. So that breed and I were out, and I'll just leave it at that. So what I want to talk about is why do we need to produce more pounds, and why should we? So we've talked about that all morning, whether it be at weaning weight, yearling weights, or into slaughter, is we're still paid on a price per hundredweight or price per pound basis. And that's how we operate. Another issue we've heard in numerous presentations over the last 15 years, we're going to have a double in size population by 2050. We have to feed more people, provide high quality protein sources. That efficiency in feeding and slaughter, and especially at slaughter, when we look in the meat packing industry, the overhead costs are the same at slaughter, whether a plant slaughters carcasses that wind up weighing 600 pounds versus 1,000 pounds. So it takes the same labor, it takes the same equipment, it takes the same utilization of time because of the way that those plants are set up on a continual movement chain to slaughter small ones or big ones. So they're not wanting to slaughter 600-pound carcasses either. And so that's important. But one thing I caution about as we say to produce more pounds is make sure it is increasing cutability, not just weight. And so we talk about yield, and we talk about dressing percentage, and that they're higher yielding and have higher dress, and that's important. And then in meats, we talk about yield grade. And so as we talk about ribeye sizes and what's optimum, there's a lot of issues with, do those ribeyes match their carcass weight? Are they large enough? And as we talk about yield grades and matching that up. And then cutting yields. What is the red meat yield of that animal? Because red meat yield is still driving a packer's bottom line. So how much fat are they having to trim off? How much yield are they getting from that carcass? So muscle to bone ratio, how much muscle is there in relation to bone, that overall cutability. And then cutout value, and that's where we get into our additional value for those prime carcasses, upper 2/3 choice, and how much are we able to yield. So a little bit of what I'll talk about. I'll review grading really briefly, have some grid value discussion, and we saw a grid passed around earlier that had a $34, almost $35 premium for prime. Then we'll talk about carcass weights and what we're kind of seeing in the industry and why we have issues with them being too heavy. And then I'll finish up with different innovative cuts to utilize those heavier carcasses. So the two quality gradings are the two grading systems that we utilize in the industry. Obviously, quality grades for predicting eating quality and palatability, and then yield grades for prediction of cutability. And I always talk to my students at OSU about this. And when we think about quality, we have to think about who is our consumer. So every person in here has a consumer. If you're selling something, you have somebody that's utilizing your product, so it's a consumer. I tell them, I always use the chairs in our classroom for an example, because I say, man, these, for some of you, are very high value. You probably like these desks. And some of you probably really dislike these desks, because sometimes you might get some big guys in there. Like last semester, I had one of our star wide receivers for Oklahoma State football team in my class. I said, you probably don't like that desk. He was like, not that much. I said, so it's not very high quality, so you're not willing to pay more for it. So that's important. But in our quality grading system, we utilize maturity and marbling score. And maturity is one thing that we, in the packing industry, don't talk about a lot, because most of all of them are A maturity. They're somewhere around 17 to 20 months of age, depending on type. There are some, right now, in the industry, there is a comment period out, and there's a lot of discussion if USDA could change the way they classify maturity in the quality grading system and start using dentition like they use for 30-month cattle. So this, right now we use this physical or physiological maturity and this ossification in these thoracic buttons to determine if an animal is still A maturity, so qualifies for prime choice select. There is talk that we could move away from this and just use dentition. So if they're under 30 on teeth, we won't worry about this physiological maturity. It won't impact a lot of cattle, but it could improve our grading system, because we know there's research data out there that shows that dentition is a better predictor than this ossification. And some animals can change on that ossification, maybe just because of a little stress or a little illness that may not be true of their age, so it could be very beneficial. And then marbling accounts for still the majority of variation in overall palatability, and that's what the quality grades are trying to predict. They're trying to predict that overall eating satisfaction that a consumer would get. And they really don't say that a prime carcass, all primes are good. And they don't say all standards or selects are bad. They just have reduced variation. So prime carcasses are more likely to have a positive eating experience than select or no-low carcasses, and that's what it's set up for. And so could we do better? Could we find a better predictor? Maybe. Many of us in the meat industry and meat science and PhD academic programs have spent the majority of our careers looking for that golden ticket, and none of us have found it. There were some things that I worked on at times that I would consider I could have probably random number generated a better experience of predicting palatability than the technologies we were trying to use. So marbling is still the best thing that we have, so it's very helpful. So then with yield grades, it's going to be an indicator of carcass cutability, or boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts from those 4 major wholesale cuts of the round, loin, rib, and chuck. And there is, again, another change that's been proposed is that we should update the yield grades. So the yield grades were developed in the 60s. So obviously cattle have changed a lot since the 60s. Our type of cattle, our use of genetics, our improvements, their efficiency, their ability to gain, and then some of the way that their shapes and deposition of muscle and deposition of fat, and there's data out there, especially on some data that I had opportunity to be a part of, and then Dr. Ty Lawrence at West Texas A&M has taken it and written some additional papers and information over especially the last 5 or 8 years, showing that our yield grades aren't that great of a predictor of this overall carcass cutability or that red meat yield. And we're probably not giving them enough credit, because we're still utilizing the same ribeye area, hot carcass weight adjustments that we have in that original regression equation that was developed to develop yield grades. And maybe we should look at things to give those cattle that have higher red meat yields a little bit more advantage in a yield grading system and take advantage of that. So with our yield grades, this is our predicted percent we have right now, and we say that yield grade 1s have a percent closely trimmed retail cuts of about 52, down to yield grade 5s of about 45%. But a lot of the new data out there shows, especially in heavier muscled cattle that are really high red meat yield, that a lot of yield grade 1s may be pushing up in the 55%, and our yield grade 2s and 3s are more similar to what we're grading as yield grade 1s. So maybe we need to make more categories, maybe we just need to look at something different. A lot of the industry doesn't apply an actual yield grade anymore. They're going to use their instruments. So several of the packers are utilizing instrument grading for quality grades, and they are utilizing instrument grading for yield grade, but their yield grade is probably not being assessed by actually stamped by the plant, and they're going off the instrument data and just being checked. So it has the ability to do an excellent job without that variation of a human person trying to grade a carcass in 3 to 7 seconds and have to estimate that ribeye size, fat thickness, put that in combination with the weight. So the instrument is an excellent tool, and it can be a really good source of that red meat yield. But then when we look at how much premium you get for a yield grade 1 and 2, and this is just a sample grid I use, and I'm going to talk about this grid a little bit because this is more of a grid that would be reported from USDA. So something that you would see, and you look over, so if we take our base at low choice yield grade 3 and we go to prime, it's only $15. And this is something that we talk about a lot at school, and when we talk about economics and we talk about getting those cattle to grade prime, and is that advantageous to add those additional days on feed? Well, you can see by the sheet that was passed around earlier, that's not very realistic because that was a national sheet and they were paying almost $35 a hundredweight for a prime premium. So I've been quizzing a lot on how we get to this. Why do we have reported so much lower than packers are actually paying? Because it seems like some of these marbling premiums are higher. And there are a lot of grids out there that are mandatory reported from some of the smaller packers that may not even have a program in place for prime or for CAB or other top choice programs. Another thing is, you notice on this grid, it's got a average choice and high choice, and so like we use this in our meat judging contest as a standard grid. We just change the prices. That we don't care color or hide color. We don't take that into account. We just do it if it's average or high choice. Well, we know that there's over probably 60 active programs that are for high, well, if you take them all, you're probably at 80, but utilize that upper 2/3 choice. But most of the packers only give that premium if it's CAB. So they, even though they're putting it into a program and they're utilizing it, so as producers of other breed types, I think we have to negotiate those types of programs and say, okay, if our cattle meet those targets from a marbling standpoint, even though they might not meet hide color, how do we take advantage of those premiums? And there's some groups that do that very well and can work together in those alliances like we've talked about in some of those vertical integration systems, but take advantage of that. So important. But then you see the very small premiums for yield grade 1s and 2s, and that's where there gets to be. So if we're producing these cattle that are higher cutability, having this higher red meat yield, how does the producer get paid back for it? And sometimes, I was talking about it with one of my fellow meat scientists at school yesterday, and he goes, well, what story are you going to tell? Are you going to say that we still don't have a very good arrangement between packers and producers and we still don't get along? And I said, well, I think that it's still in debate and we still have to go to the next step. And we do have packers that are willing to pay some premiums for red meat yield and some of those cutout yields. It's just still something that's evolving and working towards, so it's one of those things we'll just take the next steps. But then you look into the discounts for carcass weight. And so this is what we'll get into more of, is why do we look at these weights that are too heavy? And why do we get hit so much at $10.50? Why is it $24 a hundredweight? And we'll talk about how we can minimize that and the reason it is and what we might have to do to combat that. So we've talked about how small this choice select spread has gotten, and it's almost inverted at this point. So I pulled this data last week. It's very seasonal. So you can see 2016, 2017, and the 5-year average. So we are at the downslope. We always come down in September and October. We just happen to be really extreme in 2017. So we've reached peak levels, and we're reaching some other bottoming. We also always go down in March. So if we know that we have cattle, again, like we talked about earlier on some of the panels, that we really need to take advantage if we know we have cattle that are only grading select of when that's the smallest. We always know it's in, usually it's right to the last half of March to the end, but this year it hit a little earlier, got small, and it got a little bigger as we got